Welcome to the second day of the Whole Earth Conference. We have 3 panels this afternoon. They will all, they are supposed to last something like 90 minutes. In each panel, the 3 panelists will start with their presentations. Afterwards, there will be a discussion of the 3 papers presentations and a break approximately 20 to 30 minutes, so that we have 3 units of 2 hours. The first panel is in English, the second 2 panels, panel 2 and panel 3 are in German.
Welcome, and welcome back for those who've been here yesterday. I will start introducing briefly the first panel, which is entitled Cybernetics and Holism, although I think the contributions deviate a bit from what the promise of this title entails. The first presentation will be by Avery F.Gordon, who is on my left from your perspective. Avery is a professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara, a sociologist and writer, and currently visiting at Goldsmiths University. Among her publications is the fabulous Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination. She's written extensively and also conducted a radio show, and still does, on California's prison industrial complex, and recently she's worked with Ines Schaber for a project on the Breitenau workhouse nearby Kassel for Documenta 13. After Avery F.Gordon, who will speak today about Herbert Marcuse's role within the whole Earth or complex, or his differences to the whole Earth complex. We'll listen to a presentation by Lars Bang Larsen, who is an art historian and curator teaching in Copenhagen, who has worked extensively on the role that psychedelia and the psychedelic experience and its modes of representation had in the Neo-Avant-Garde. After Lars's presentation, we'll listen to a talk by Laurence Rickels, whose publications include I Think I Am, Philip K. Dick, and the book that was also one of our sources, The Case of California, psychoanalysis of California, or the role of California in in the history of psychoanalysis. And after the 3 presentations, as Diedrich announced, we'll immediately enter into an open discussion. So I'd like to invite Avery to take the floor.
So thank you, Anselm, for inviting me, and also to all the staff at the house for their hospitality. The title of my talk is actually The Great Refusal, Herbert Marcuse in California. Herbert Marcuse, the philosopher Marcuse, was living in California when he wrote an essay on liberation, it's like this. His analysis of the worldwide opposition to capitalist life forms that had been gathering steam since the early 1960s, and that is the subject of my talk, which I think might be viewed as just kind of maybe like another panel in the section of the exhibition called The Earth is Not Whole. Herbert Marcuse moved to San Diego in 1965 from Brandeis University to take a position in the philosophy department as a professor of political thought at the University of California. Conservative, white, with heavily policed borders to the south, San Diego was nothing like the liberal Jewish intellectual culture of East Coast Brandeis. San Diego was one of the main centers of the US military-industrial complex, anchored by a rather large conglomeration of aerospace and weapons manufacturing companies and the US Navy. As a city, San Diego's population and its wealth, which is substantial, has been historically defined by being the home port of the US Pacific Fleet, which today, just to give you an idea of what that means, provides support for 57 ships, 180 tenant commands, those are command, like battalions you would call them, 3,000 contractors, and 5,000 naval families in residence. So overall, the base includes about 2,000 acres of land and 326 acres of water. The University of California at San Diego was established in 1960 on the site of the former Scripps Institute of Oceanography, and it became the premier science and engineering research campus in the large UC system on the basis of its extensive military or military-related research contracts. This was something that Marcuse grasped rather quickly and firsthand, that the constitutive importance of militarism to capitalist expansion and capitalist knowledge. In this sense, the Vietnam War was only one instance in an increasingly, at the time, visible crisis. We tend to associate California student radicalism in general, but especially student radicalism during this era with Northern California, UC Berkeley, the free speech movement, then Governor Reagan, Ronald Reagan's now very infamous sending of troops against the People's Park protesters, all of which you can see of this in the exhibition. But there was also considerable anti-war and anti-authoritarian oppositional activity to the South in Los Angeles, and also among the students at UC San Diego and at San Diego State, which was the much older campus. This was reflected in the campaign, the American Legion, which is the country's largest veterans organization, a very conservative and influential political force who were, I would call them fundamentalist supporters of the Vietnam War. The American Legion launched a campaign in 1968 to force UC San Diego Chancellor William McGill to fire Marcuse, who was routinely described in the news as the thinker of the student movement. Wearing his, sorry, okay, this is my most complicated little slide here, so I have to get everything going at the same time. Wearing his uniform, you're not going to see that, you're going to see something else. Harry Foster, who was one of the Legionnaires, told the following to a local television news reporter.
They had the riots in Paris when the French had to bring out the troops and the tanks. Marcuse was there. And they had the riots with the students in Berlin. Marcuse was there, convinced that he has to convey some of his ideas and thoughts directly to the students. And in this lies the danger of Marcuse to the University of California.
To his credit, Chancellor McGill deflected the attack. He did not fire Professor Marcuse, as they like to call him, even after the American Legion offered McGill $20,000 to buy out Marcuse's contract. The publication in 1964 of One-Dimensional Man brought Marcuse considerable public attention. The book was a remarkably, I think, prescient analysis of what Marcuse called the insane reasonableness of the unfreedom that characterizes capitalist democracies, and the closing of what he called the universe of thought and behavior upon which the capacity for negative critique and opposition depends. In the swell of US post-war affluence and the reworked manifest destiny for the new so-called American century, Marcuse focused in on what he called the comfortable and liberal realization of corporate capitalism and on its economic and military hold in the four continents, its neo-colonial empire, and most importantly, he says, quote, its unshaken capacity to subject the majority of the underlying population to its overwhelming productivity and force. To put it too a little simply, in One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse argues that the technical capacities of advanced capitalist society have produced what he calls technological irrationality, formally somewhat unthinkable in Marxist terms, and also new forms of social control embedded at the level of psychosocial needs and organized through repressive desublimation. The buy-out or the buy-in of the Western industrial working classes through what we now tend to call the Fordist bargain was already in Marcuse's thinking a holistic, material, psycho-social, economic, political condition, requiring him to give up on this class as a privileged agent of revolution and historical change. Actually existing socialism was equally implicated in different ways, continually deflected from its original goals to the point of no return. In 1964, Marcuse warns that we are already forced to buy more and more of our existence. This is his phrase, that we are forced to buy our existence as the realization of capital on the market. The universe is not yet totally closed, but Marcuse is very worried that total enclosure is coming, that we will invite it as a friend, or more accurately as a sexual partner, and then we will not have one world, but a one-dimensional world, in which we no longer can distinguish between what enslaves us and what we most cherish and desire. One-Dimensional Man turns out to be an analysis of modern enslavement that makes an argument against the integration of all those not yet assimilated, quote, outsiders and, quote, minorities, and thus an argument against a liberal race politics that was dominant and that was also nonetheless still dangerous enough to generate massive political reaction. It's an argument against integration and a plea for something he called the Great Refusal, by which he meant, quote, the protest against that which is. At the time, what students and grassroots readers took away from books, they often put on posters or billboards. And the tagline of One-Dimensional Man indicates, I think, its standpoint, nowhere near the middle-class sociology of Diederichsen's equally famous The Lonely Crowd. One-Dimensional Man's tagline was, quote, free election of masters does not abolish the masters or the slaves. And in the longer passage he continues, free choice among a wide variety of goods and services does not signify freedom if these sustain a life of toil and fear, or if they sustain alienation. And the spontaneous reproduction of superimposed needs by the individual does not establish autonomy, it only testifies to the efficacy of the controls. If the view from outer space, untethered and unmarked by the military-industrial complex that enabled it, was an iconic image of the Northern California whole earth counterculture, the view on the ground, rooted and indelibly marked by that which made you a recognizable outsider or troublemaker, was the signifier of the third world or internationalist political culture that shadowed it. It was here on the ground and in practice as an intellectual and a teacher that Marcuse took the intellectual and political standpoint that would be seriously articulated in an essay on liberation, in part in an effort to prevent it from being trivialized and condescended to. Marcuse's students were thus amused that such a sophisticated and learned man's office was filled with over 20 kitschy figurines of hippopotamuses in a variety of garish colors and poses. And they recount that Marcuse told them that he loved the hippos because they, quote, embodied the reality of absurdity and the immense possibilities of the imagination. And why not, too, the somewhat illicit pleasures of dancing in the swirling river and rolling in the muddy grass, big, bold, pink mouth wide open with enormous teeth used only for fighting, at which the hippo, it turns out, vegetarian that it is, excels. By 1969, when an essay on liberation was published and Marcuse's always open office door gave him a perfect view of the UC San Diego student occupation of the administration building, the great refusal he had called for in One-Dimensional Men had arrived. Marcuse had moved to California in time for the Watts Rebellion, 1965, and all those that followed: Cleveland, Omaha, Newark, Detroit, Minneapolis, Chicago, Baltimore, Stonewall in New York a year later. And he saw in Third World liberation in Asia and Latin America and Africa, in the youth counterculture and in the Black Power, women's, and students' movements, amidst all their differences, disagreements, and inevitable limitations, the, quote, outline of the limits of the established societies and of their power of containment. Their opposition to corporate capitalism, he thought, was, quote, radical and total. From the enclosures of one-dimensionality, the, quote, new sensibility tried to grasp or reach for, quote, the whole of experience. An essay on liberation begins like this. In proclaiming the great refusal, the militants recognized the mark of social repression even in the most sublime manifestations of traditional culture, even in the most spectacular manifestations of technical progress. They have again raised a specter, the specter of a revolution which subordinates the development of productive forces and higher standards of living to the requirements of creating solidarity for the human species, for abolishing poverty and misery beyond all national frontiers and spheres of interest, and for the attainment of peace. In one word, they have taken the idea of revolution out of the continuum of repression and placed it into its authentic dimension, that of liberation. The great refusal was certainly cultural, but it was not merely a counterculture. The great refusal was a demand for another form of life, one Marcuse said was, quote, worth living. To take, he writes, the life of human beings out of the hands of politicians and managers and generals necessitates a struggle which can no longer be contained by the rules and regulations of a pseudo-democracy in a free Orwellian world. More than this, a life worth living would require, Marcuse calls for, new organs for the alternative. In the essay, Marcuse returns to the question of needs that had so preoccupied him in One-Dimensional Man, but this time in an effort to establish an organic, or what he calls a, quote, biological foundation for socialism. If we do not, Marcuse writes, wish to stop at merely improving the existing state of affairs, we must, he says, lay bare and liberate the type of person who wants revolution, who must have revolution because otherwise he or she will fall apart. That, Marcuse says, is the subjective factor, which, he cautions, is more than a subjective factor. The subjective factor, which Marcuse felt was one of the chief tasks of materialism, refers to the process by which methodical disengagement from the rules of order and refusal of what he calls its false and cruel affluence becomes not only the basis of a political practice that in principle or in theory rejects the introjection of what he describes as a terrible but profitably functioning society, but also becomes the basis of a need for a non-exploitative world. If capitalism has created a second nature which ties, he says, many of us libidinally and aggressively to the commodity form, then a different kind of second or maybe third nature is required to counter, quote, the counter-revolution anchored in the instinctual structure. The process by which a subject vitally needs to be free from the terms of the life on offer and acts on this need now, not later, after the revolution, not when the system says it's okay. This need constitutes what Marcuse calls the, quote, instinctual basis for freedom without exploitation. The instinct, or the disposition, is another term to use, Marcuse sees in the Great Refusal is the counter-revolution, he says, of an organism which is no longer capable of adapting to the performances required for well-being under domination, no longer capable of tolerating the established capitalist way of life. When this organism follows the instinct for freedom without exploitation and adapts to it, Marcuse continues, then, quote, rebellion has taken root in the very nature, the, quote, biology of the individual. It has become, that's to say, our second or perhaps third nature, and we have begun to grow those sensory organs for the alternative required to change ourselves and our way of existence. This is obviously a rather perverse and unnatural biology, as cultural and political resistance is its antithetical organic core. And Marcuse is aware of the strain he's putting on the term to use it as he does. The word biology is always in quotation marks or followed by a question mark. But he does use the word to designate the process by which inclinations, behavior patterns, and aspirations become, he says, vital needs, which, if not satisfied, will cause us to fall apart. Human nature is always changing, Marcuse notes, but changing what feels natural and what authorities we internalize, changing first reactions in behaviors and identifications we repeat automatically, changing the calculations that define our very sense of survival. These changes are slow and painful. These changes are met with powerful social and psychic resistance. These changes make us feel as if we are falling apart. Switching the electrifying poles that carry the currents of value so that we experience falling apart entirely differently, so that our entire sensitivity apparatus recoils at what it previously loved. This is what Marcuse meant by developing organs for the alternative, a scandalous process of becoming what I calling indifference, without which we cannot change our way of existence. Out there and here, we must accommodate extreme possibilities for freedom, the scandal of the qualitative difference, Marcuse writes. Developing organs for the alternative involves turning longings into something else, however muted or marginal or implicit or extreme, into vital needs, into things that you cannot and will no longer live without. Developing organs for the alternative involves acquiring both an individual and collective indifference to all the promises of happiness, worth, and freedom that deliver their opposites or deformed versions of themselves. Developing organs for the alternative is about learning how to anticipate and demonstrate, quote, the existential quality of the new form of life in the very struggles for its realization, about the ingression of the future into the present. Of course, the ferment of refusal continued, and it was not genteel or earnest or naive or mercantilist or on its way to becoming hippie rich, but gritty, angry at the far edge of repressive tolerance. The Black Panthers exercising their right to bear arms and serving breakfast to neighborhood school children, Jonathan Jackson storming the Marin County Courthouse and the Worldwide Organization in support of Angela Davis, George Jackson's letters from and in organizing in Soledad Prison, the Attica prisoners' rebellion and the ones that followed, the renegade Vietnam winter soldiers and their hearings, radical feminism and sexual liberation, the American Indian movement, the Young Lords, Move, Earth First, and so on. Most of which were met by violent suppression of the rebellious and the expendable without mercy. In many ways, the California of the 1960s and early 70s, that is the background reference for Marcuse's essay, ends in the mid-1980s, when now President Ronald Reagan puts in place the last infrastructural elements for the mass imprisonment of poor people of color, shut out of the legal new economy and abandoned by the society to the state police. Marcuse arrived in California when it was rich and the capital of the military-industrial complex. By the time he died in 1979, the expansionist nationalist economy was in recession, and California was about to become the capital of the prison industrial complex, where containment or enclosure in a total institutional world took a more brutal form for too many. But it would be unwise, I think, to localize too much both the promise and the containment of this particular moment. The instinct for freedom without exploitation that Marcuse so beautifully and shamelessly essayed, the effort to abolish misery beyond all frontiers, to achieve peace, to make a life worth living for the majority is very old. There were many great refusals before the 1960s. There were even great refusals of capitalism before it even really arrived. And there will be more to come, always on the way from someplace out there or in you, you've been told can't possibly exist. Thanks. Can I just say one word, just because all the images went. You were just looking at the images. I just want to say one word about these paintings. These paintings are by Sandow Birk, a California artist, in his Prisonation series, in which he, in the early 2000s, went and made a very traditional landscape painting of every prison in California. So there are, at the time, 32 in the series. They go with Alex's photographs.
Thank you very much, Avery. Lars.
Yes. And thank you for the invitation, of course. Is this good? Is this good? Yeah. Okay. So. Yeah. Here's the bomb. Here's the computer. Space travel. The pill. And LSD. And these were all, as we know from the whole Earth exhibition, these were all new inventions, new technologies, new media that define politics of life and power of life in the post-war era. And looking back, we can today acknowledge the 68ers, the counterculturalists, and the flower children for their fighting spirit, their anti-authoritarianism, and their redefinition of what politics could be. However, what also makes the 68er unacceptable today is their gender orthodoxy and heteronormativity, their populist eagerness to go head-to-head with the spectacle, their romantic concepts of radical subjectivity, their general inability to articulate disaffection in something other than affirmative terms, their exaltation of libido, their nationalism, and their awful music. However, considering the cybernetic aspects of the counterculture opens up a new line of questioning, a new line of inquiry. And the whole Earth exhibition goes a long way to dismantle and take apart the received idea of the 60s counterculturalists as Luddites and machine haters. So the exhibition shows that the counterculture was also hugely informed by new media, techno-utopias, and technologies of the self. So in this view of the 60s, evolution tends to replace revolution, and networked ecologies must be considered alongside all the photogenic dramas in the streets that we already know from the decade. And dreams of self-governing circuits supplement the famous demands for freedom, justice, and creativity. And instead of thinking the counterculture as a festival of life and love, human life, human love, we must bear in mind that it also entertained ideas of an equivalence between the electronic circuit and the nervous system. So this cybernetic inquiry is another way of showing how our present bears the mark of the 60s and its counterculture. But it opens up this history in a more ramified and ultimately less decade-specific way. It's also a perspective, as was also discussed yesterday in Fred's lecture, it's also a perspective that forces us to consider the marriage between holism and technology, as was helped establish the infrastructure for capitalism as we know it, the current union of soul and economy, you could say. And just to give you a definition of holism, or what I mean when I say holism, and that definition is completely homegrown, that's my own making. But when I say holism, I'm thinking of a unifying type of worldview that tends to disregard or smooth over difference, and that speculates in or with systems that are capable of producing harmony or balance. So a holism doesn't proceed analytically by reducing an object to its smallest constituent parts. Instead, holism is characterized by organizing objects and systems in wholes. So you could say that a holism is concerned with what can be organized and lived. It's not concerned with what can be thought or struggled about. And in the Whole Earth exhibition, gives many examples of ecosystemic techno-holistic thinking. For a few more post-war or 60s examples of holism, one can also consider these. There was Martin Luther King's idea of the beloved community, which was King's vision for a desegregated society of total interrelatedness, as he called it, of total interrelatedness across the races. Somebody who was widely read in the 60s, but nearly completely forgotten today, was Teilhard de Chardin, a wayward priest and paleontologist who foresaw a new evolutionary stage of collectivization or socialization, as he called it, through powerful systems of communication. And he was, de Chardin was talking about what he called the noosphere, which he conceptualizes as a brain of brains required by this new evolutionary stage of collective life. He called it the terrestrial sphere of a thinking substance. So a thinking envelope of all collective life. The noosphere. So, it's kind of obvious that this noosphere lends itself to comparisons with the internet. All of that. There was also Marshall McLuhan, of course, and his tribal concept of the global village. That's the famous one, but McLuhan also talked about an electronic communion, even. He says that the Christian concept of the mystical body, the notion of all men as members of the body of Christ, becomes technologically a fact under electronic conditions, the mystical body. And in the counterculture proper, there was Timothy Leary, the LSD guru, who outlined the sacred psychedelic lifestyle with machinic metaphors in his famous slogan, "Tune in, turn on, drop out." And of course, here we have sort of the overlap between the counterculture, holism, and cybernetics, because turning on and tuning in is what you do with your radio or your radar system, or a thermostat. For those of you who want more than just a homegrown definition of holism, there was a good book out a couple of years ago by Linda Sargent Wood called A More Perfect Union, Holistic Worldviews. So, and another important Cold War variation on holism that we shouldn't forget is paranoia. I would like to offer, the Red Scare paranoia of communists, paranoid constructions to prevent another war. The English novelist J.G. Ballard talks about not the post-war era, but the pre-third. So, thereby saying that the post-World War II era was nothing but a period of latency before a new conflagration. So, it's going to come, the pre-third. So, and paranoia is also a unifying kind of worldview, but one that creates a double of the world, you could say, by drawing up all the unconnectable dots. Instead of harmony, of course, paranoia tends to create dissonance and confusion. However, cybernetics and cybernetic concepts were not only employed by the counterculture with a view to planetary healing. it's important to consider the non- or anti-holistic uses of cybernetics too, because there were strands of artistic and countercultural experimentation that revolved around difference. And I think this fact is important for a discussion of the predicament of living in a world that supposedly has no outsides, and what we're going to do about that, or how we can think that. Here's the Grateful Dead, and sort of the first anti-holistic use of cybernetics that I'd like to mention is a rather widespread one, namely the countercultural misuse of the central cybernetic concept of feedback. Because feedback, of course, was a signature effect in acid rock in the 60s, and acid rock was defined by Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead as what you listen to when you're high on acid, as simple as that. And the pure feedback noise belonged in the context of live music, typically. So the Grateful Dead would devote a brief section of their live shows to a feedback-driven composition. And many bands, such as the Velvet Underground, would finish their gigs with their instruments leaning against the amps, so that the instruments would play on their own after the band members had left. Just to very briefly give you a rundown of this idea of feedback and why and how one can misuse it. Cybernetics operates with two definitions of feedback: negative and positive feedback. So the negative feedback describes the preservation of circulation in a system by aiming to maintain equilibrium. To maintain equilibrium through adaptability. So this negative feedback is how an amplifying system works, or the thermostat, or the radar system, or the computer, and other machines that keep flows of information under control. So positive feedback, on the other hand, works against adaptability by allowing flows of information to go out of control. And to attain positive feedback, one quite simply removes the control functions that are otherwise located where the information loop would meet itself. And thereby one creates a self-accelerating process. And this is what musicians did in the 60s when they sent already amplified sound back into the amplifying system to create feedback noise or sonic texture or color of the sound. So the characteristic of a negative feedback is its homogenizing effect. Deviations are filtered, eliminated. And this is unlike the positive feedback that tends to increase heterogeneity as small differences are amplified into large discrepancies. So I would argue that in this simple way, the counterculture, or the music of the counterculture, if you can call it that, divorced technology from its social tendency as well as from its holistic tendency. And this is important for two reasons, at least. Namely that acid rock feedback was a way of pushing the processing of information in a system to the point where this process could oscillate out of control and possibly end up destroying the system. If positive feedback goes on for long enough, it creates a kind of an explosion inside the system, so you can burn out the amplifying system, for instance. And of course, this idea of destroying the system would be a figure or a metaphor that would have appealed to the counterculture. So in this way, you could argue that feedback noise makes for an abstract and intrasystemic and non-constructive form of resistance. It was not a kind of cosmic reparation, and one cannot compare it to heterotopic ideas of dropping out and going to other places like India, the rock festival, Colorado. Instead, the feedback noise describes a way of literally re-entering the system in order to turn it inside out, perhaps. And the other reason why feedback, this idea of feedback is important here, the misuse of feedback is important, is that it cannibalizes surrounding space, of course, because it plays back the whole of the space. But there's also a speculation about time in the cybernetic feedback noise. It makes time pregnant, you could say. It generates unstable temporal effects. You could say that the audio feedback is the sound of a kind of spiraling time, perhaps, an event that exists in a dynamic way in both the past and the future. So I'm only saying this because in a world that is ruled through connected space, time has been eclipsed, or space wins over time, you could say. So time or chronopolitics is an important sort of speculation to carry along when we talk about these things. Next example is a poster from Sweden, work by Sture Johannesson, graphic artist, Thou Shalt Not Kill, from '67. And in this poster you see a photo of the American President Johnson behind his desk, placed inside a temple of corporate logos. At the center top here, there is a red text that reads across an I, and the text reads "Think." I don't know if you can make it out. And "Think" was the long-time slogan of IBM International Business Machines. To the sides of this image there are a body count of dead Viet Cong soldiers and of the suicide action of a Buddhist monk. This is first of all an anti-capitalist, anti-war poster in which Western democracy is depicted as being fundamentally compromised by its economic interests in the Vietnam War. And we can pun that the corporate logos represent democracy's true logos, with the president as the puppet of capitalism. So Sture's use of imagery from mainstream media and advertising places the poster in a spectacular realm where technology and capital touches life. He doesn't reach back to supposedly uncorrupted science. Instead of aiming to reveal false consciousness, he doesn't call for no logo, you could say, but he calls for more logo, right? Which is quite counterintuitive. And you could say that the IBM slogan at the top, is where the poster performs a breakdown of critical distance. Thinking is already colonized. What remains is affects and nausea. No outside, really. The irony is, the deliberate irony is that a little later, a few years later, Sture went to IBM in Stockholm and asked them that he could work with digital graphics on their computers because he wanted to work with digital graphics, and of course nobody had computers at the time apart from the military and the multinational corporations. He told me that he considered computers as, the toy of the devil, basically. But here, a few years later, he deliberately got in bed with the devil. And there was a sort of, so this was politically ambiguous, working with IBM at this time. Or not only politically ambiguous, it was offensive. It was politically offensive. So there was a provocation in this, of course, or a certain amount of moral exhibitionism, you could say, in his working with IBM. The last example that I'm showing is also involves Sture Johannesson, this time with his partner Charlotte Johannesson, which is an exhibition that the two of them organized in Stockholm in 1976, which was an homage to Ulrike Meinhof. It was called Om Tyskland i tiden, about Germany in time. And it opened in July '76, a few months or shortly after Meinhof had died in Stuttgart. It was an homage to Meinhof and not the Red Army faction. So there was no Andreas Baader here, who by Sture and Charlotte were considered to be a Frankfurt playboy. It was instead one had the paraphernalia from Red Army faction. One had leaflets and flyers related to Meinhof's work. Of course, this was According to the artist, this exhibition did not condone political violence. It was a way of addressing an intellectual who had put down her pen and picked up a gun. So it was also an homage to a woman fighter, a woman terrorist. So it was also about Ulrike Meinhof as a feminist icon. There's much to say about the exhibition, really, but what I would like to finish with here is a work by Charlotte Johannesson, because the exhibition had all the trappings and the content of a political art exhibition. There was, propaganda in there, of a certain sense, and there was a sort of Catholic aesthetic to it. It was a shrine to Meinhof. However, the exhibition also featured two tapestries, two textiles by Charlotte. One of them is the one you see here on the right, which is a weaving featuring Snoopy from Peanuts playing the Red Baron sitting on top of his kennel, and the roof of his kennel is in the German colors, the colors of the German flag. And on the roof of the kennel it says Frei die RAF, free the Red Army faction. And Snoopy is shooting a machine gun down on a tank that is wheeling around in the bottom of the image. And the numbers next to the tank in the bottom of the image are the civil registration numbers of Charlotte and Sture. And of course, this is a rather sort of a complex image, to be sure, because it's a feminist use of traditional crafts, weaving, in a work that appropriates pop imagery, Snoopy, and emulates a computer screen at the same time, because as you can see, the weaving is pixelated. So sort of the weaving emulates a pixelated computer screen. And on top of that, it's a work that deals with the Red Army faction. So this is quite dizzying, to be sure, and I'm not quite sure what it means or what it signifies. It's no unequivocal support of the Red Army faction or any struggle. You wouldn't, genossen Snoopy. So whatever it is not holistic. So, yeah, thank you.
For the invitation to reflect on California once again, this time in its science and science fiction settings. When I proposed A Case of California in 1991, I postulated that when German language emigres in California during the Nazi era saw reflected back on the coast their souvenir of the German Europe they left behind, only tested, cleansed, reprojected as future omen, that California attained consciousness, while Germany, also in quotes, confronted as problem the adolescence that the culture of Bildung had invented as ideal. Germany and California, I argued, were the two coasts of the traumatic history of the 20th century, and the parameters of the long-deferred psychology of adolescence in psychoanalysis. Today, I am considering briefly the core pursuit in cybernetics of what we might call the whole brain, which also bears on our understanding of mass psychology and simulation. In Philip K. Dick's The Simulacra, the simulation of authority and of the neighbor is the social order society carries out and the secret its ruling class keeps. But it is a secret history of the science fiction genre that Dick's novel at the same time carries forward. Dick's collected work inherited the metabolization of Germany in science fiction, from the establishment of German science fiction as the transformation of the wound of gravity and grave into the wonder or miracle of takeoff, to Germany as the problem and object of integration in the post-war future worlds of science fiction. In the simulacra, Dick confronts us with a new entity, USEA, the future state of cohabitation of the United States or California with Germany. If there is a bi-coastal dialectic whereby symptoms of Nazi German provenance wash up onto the coast, then Dick brings it to its crisis point with the prospect of Germany's post-war integration so close to home. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and Ubik, the difficulty of this integration is represented as the ongoing social problem of psychopathy, in which the failure to empathize and mourn tests the limits of tolerance. The turtle that can still be kept as pet in one of the mass housing units of the German Californian state in the simulacra sets the place for the android test in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. In the test situation of the film adaptation, the first question or trigger looks at the extent of the subject's concern for a tortoise flipped on its back baking in the sun. In his 1972 essay, The Android and the Human, Dick sets up cybernetics as external referee of the android test by selecting experiments with the robot known as Tortoise as exemplary of its general method. I quote, "Cybernetics, a valuable recent scientific discipline articulated by the late Norbert Wiener, saw valid comparisons between the behavior of machines and humans, with the view that a study of machines would yield valuable insights into the nature of our own behavior. By studying what goes wrong with a machine, for example, when two mutually exclusive tropisms function simultaneously in one of Gray Walter's synthetic turtles, producing fascinatingly intricate behavior in the befuddled turtles, one learns perhaps a new, more fruitful insight into what in humans was previously called neurotic behavior." As in Dick's empathy test, there is in both Wiener and Walter's analogy between machine and man the intermediary step of the animal. In Wiener's cybernetics, or control and communication in the animal and the machine, we follow the animal step by implication when considering the brain, not specified as human brain, in relation to computing. Quote, "It is not the empty physical structure of the computing machine that corresponds to the brain, but the combination of this structure with the instructions given it at the beginning of a chain of operations, and with all the additional information stored and gained from outside in the course of this chain. This information is stored in some physical form, in the form of memory." According to Walter's The Living Brain, cybernetics picks up where magical mimicry of life left off copying external appearances and imitates scientifically performance and behavior instead. A mechanical imitation of life becomes a robot, an imitation of the living brain, when it is endued with spontaneous motion and can lay claim to autonomy or self-regulation. Quote, "But if the performance of a model is to be demonstrably a fair imitation of cerebral activity, the conditions of stimulation and behavior must equally be comparable with those of the brain. Not in looks, but in action, the model must resemble an animal." The first attempt to render the brain via a robot that would imitate not the appearance, but the performance or behavior of a living creature seems to have been suggested by the familiar test of animal intelligence in finding the way out of a maze. The robot in question, Ashby's homeostat, like a fireside cat or dog, Walter advises, only stirs when disturbed and then methodically finds a comfortable position and goes to sleep again. What we find in this fireside companion is not only the virtue of self-control and the blessing of homeostasis, not only an exemplification of placidity, but also of plasticity, one of the basic principles that seem to govern animal engineering. This means roughly that every part of the mechanism is reversible, interchangeable, and expendable, but not replaceable. In the self-regulation or self-reflexivity of disposable parts, there is one place that remains inside irreplaceable and extra. While Walter began making his tortoise in 1948, soon to be featured in popular magazines as new addition to the domestic setting, it more immediately inherited two techniques mobilized during the Battle of Britain, which crossed the inventor's mind when a colleague came to his research facility, which was developing scanning mechanisms to track planes and bombs, to get computing help with the planning and production of goal-seeking missiles. Walter, the two ideas, goal-seeking and scanning, had combined as the essential mechanical conception of a working model that would behave like a very simple animal. Walter's tortoise, or more properly Machina Speculatrix, was able to demonstrate the first of several principles exemplified in the mechanisms of most living creatures. Quote, "A typical animal propensity is to explore the environment rather than to wait passively for something to happen. This faculty gives the device its name and distinguishes it from other machines. The most elaborate computing machine does not look round for problems to solve." According to Walter, the cybernetic reliance on behaviorism derived from animal experiment and applied to the mechanical explanation of the brain relegates artificial intelligence via computing to the status of specialized support of the brain. Fact arrangement and appraisal, for example, can be delegated to machinery just as management of our bodies long since was delegated. In its one-sidedness, a computing model, as Walter advises, cannot represent the general condition of the brain, what we might call the whole brain, a first view of which the robotic animal provided. Gotthard Günther, the German Hegelian philosopher who signed in as cyberneticist while in exile in the United States, was commissioned by John W. Campbell to examine in articles for the magazine Astounding Science Fiction the possible functioning and theory of certain props of science fiction, like the robot brain and the time warp. Indeed, it has been suggested that it was through science fiction that he found his bearings in the New World, also to the extent that the departure from the classical Occidental tradition of thinking he followed or found on its map coincided with his ongoing work on a three-valued logic that could supplement Aristotelian logic. Günther does not so much argue that science fiction is a Cold War exclusive as that the genre has always been American or anti-American. Science fiction is the first understanding of global culture, the jump cut from primitive culture to world culture in circumvention of the civilized past of the high cultures grounded in the East. While primitive culture was always a planetary phenomenon, the high cultures were tied to geographically circumscribed areas of Mother Earth and tongue. By its ungrounded projection of artificial habitats based on reason alone and its unabashed manipulation of time, science fiction was the first forum for Western cultural aspirations unbound by the Eastern past. Science fiction visions of outer space presuppose not only a universal planetary culture, but also a new non-classical conception of reality. This conception goes beyond the home on the range of all metaphysical imagining from back east. The old exception, the doppelganger, is the new rule. The idea in science fiction that Günther identifies as the new basic is that of self as something that stands in interchangeable relationship to its own content. By its artificial distribution of reflection processes across man and machine, cybernetics pushes together the multiple exchanges of human self-contradiction on one side of a new exchange in which the man-made mechanism takes up the other side. With the prospect of interstellar travel upon us, the proper destiny of all cybernetic science, Günther writes, is not to build a duplicate of the human mind, but a non-Aristotelian brain that works along a three-valued thought pattern. Once we can go the distance to the stars in our thought, we will be before the alien mind, which will be more alien even than the personification of the lengths and logics we will have gone through. Since no direct contact is possible or survivable, Gunther nominates the robot brain, which is capable of non-Aristotelian logic, as most likely to succeed as our intermediary, specifically as thought translator between irreconcilable logics. I quote Gunther, "What is true for the human mind is false for the alien mind, and therefore has the combined characteristic it is true and false at the same time. It is to clarify this contradiction that the third value must be introduced. By rotating the three values, the translation machine produces its own alternative logic of two values, not those the human mind used before the translation commenced, but instead the opposing valuational shifts, which can then cross the human and the alien range of thought at the same time. Otherwise, to be or not to be, Gunther underscores, remains our final question. Even though there must be, even here, a common denominator and consequently a third value, there can't be for us. According to Gunther, the total negation of our logic in the encounter with the alien mind would negate the very existence of the human mind. Quote, in fact, total negation is the logic definition of death. It is absolute death that separates the terrene Aristotelian from the contra-Aristotelian alien mind. In a series of articles titled Achilles and the Tortoise, Gunther examined the time warp and jump conceits employed in science fiction to get around the inconceivable prospect of interstellar transport. Gunther starts out with Zeno's paradox to show that motion itself, whether across the span of a foot race or the distance to the stars, is unthinkable because it involves infinity. It may seem strange that something so commonplace, something we do every day as long as we live, involves unsolved logical and scientific problems. Once outer space is the object or objective of thought, however, the harnessing at close quarters of natural forces not yet understood comes to an end. Calculus, for example, did not contribute to understanding motion, but permitted us to use it. As Gaston Bachelard showed in the case of fire and Wolfgang Hagen with regard to electricity, science fantasy or delusion is internal to science to the extent that science is given to make use of natural forces in advance of their comprehension. Hagen argues that the delusion of spiritualism spreads on tracks parallel to the influence of telegraphy on media, as evident in the ever-expanding newspaper networks. But he neglects to separate from the epistemophilic crisis the structure of testing through which his examples pass. Modern spiritualism won from investigative reports in the press and scientific experiment at universities the reality that testing accords to improbable claims, even when defrocked as feigned and falsified. Occult mediums welcomed testing of their claims by experts, even or especially if the experts were driven to debunk the supernatural. As conveyed by the press accounts, the press never missed a chance to give prominent coverage to investigation of mediums. The experts' verdict, however negative, placed the tested situation within the realm of hypothesis and possibility. Even historically then, Freud's notion of reality testing as the function of the ego that through perception and motility distinguishes reality in the alternation between inner and outer worlds is heir to this relay of test sites, mediums, and ghosts. As supplement to Avital Ronell's analysis of testing in the test drive, it proves possible, even necessary, to follow reality testing as the most comprehensive model of the general test situation. That Freud's most extensive reflection on reality testing can be found in his essay Mourning and Melancholia has not been registered by the editorial apparatus, but Freud's closest reader, Melanie Klein, belabored the multiple references Freud made to reality testing in that brief article to introduce her notion of the inner world in mourning. According to Klein, identification builds a safety zone of internalized good objects that must take the brunt of first and direct impact of traumatic loss. Before loss can be singularly addressed or redressed, the inner afterlife must be shored up again at its very foundations. What cuts deepest is loss of contact with the good object. The work of mourning consists in the all-out effort to resecure the original objects internalized as lost and found. A new loss brings back all the losses, which must first be reinstalled and refound inside before the interpersonal work of mourning can commence. What the outer world is good for, finally, is to reality test by its plainer text the staying power of the inner world. In The Android and the Human, Dick addresses as evolutionary prospect that it is up to the unreliable teen to secure the future. Quote, either through laziness, short attention span, perversity, criminal tendencies, whatever label you wish to pin on the kid to explain his unreliability is fine. In his case studies of problem children and teens, D.W. Winnicott sought to nip the budding psychopaths at the onset of their antisocial tendencies. His signature intervention was to characterize the initial nuisance behavior as expression of hope, which illuminates the importance of the environment. The meaning of hope, according to the word's Germanic prehistory, preserved to this day as verhoffen in the German language of hunters, scratches and sniffs in animal tracks. In a word, hope begins as the startled response to a sudden change in our environment, whereby we, humans and animals alike, take the moment of hesitation to try out in our minds a new next move. Dick proposes rewriting Ray Bradbury's story about a citizen of LA who recognizes that no one is in the driver's seat in the police car tailing him as follows. I would have had a teenager behind the wheel of the police car. He has stolen it while the policeman is in a coffee shop on his lunch break, and the kid is going to resell it by tearing it down into parts. The horror Dick thus seeks to counter lies not in the evidence of the car's own tropism, but in the prospect of the place unfilled by the driver, the vacuum packing of the missing in denial. Or as he puts it, the absence of something vital, that is the horrific part, the apocalyptic vision of a nightmare future. It is not only the amalgamation of adolescence and psychopathy that vies for the extra or empty place that draws cybernetic testing onward, but out of the traumatic histories cybernetics inherits, even mourning presses to find there its onset in a place for absence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I think it's been quite a lot on the table, and I struggle with the wish to simplify and the fear of destroying much of the beauty of the kind of trajectories. I'm trying to put one question forward, which does attempt to. I'll try to put it once very, very simple, and then maybe a bit less simple. In the scenography of inversions of the that we have listened to in terms of the utopian figures, whether they are called utopian or negatively described within a dystopian or a figure of absence. wondering one very simple thing in terms of how we are approaching this cybernetic dream today, and maybe would just like to hear your, even if polemic, answers to that. The momentums where the cybernetic dream touches upon a profound ability to almost inhabit the condition of its own inversion or its anti-closure. I'm not sure if my fingers have understood, so I'm trying better. Very simply, what is it that you, each of you who wishes to answer, would want to tell us one should not fall behind in the cybernetic articulation? Is that something you could deal with? I'm sorry for the performing this struggle to coming to terms with that. You want to rescue me?
I mean, I don't know if maybe one proposal I could make that would even be really simplistic would to look at the notion of thirdness that we've heard somehow across the table, and how that relates to one of the thoughts of yesterday, or one of the themes of yesterday, the replacement of politics. And of course, in the scenario with the adolescent, the adolescent as a new unreliable actor, it would be kind of especially in the connection with Gottlob Günther's three-value logic, it would be kind of very radical thirdness that can be, of course, being connected with Californian counterculture. The alternative use of feedback in Lars' example, it's also a kind of perverse third in relation to the positive and the negative feedback. But and the example and Mapule's idea of a third nature as the source of as the only possible source of overcoming a capitalism that is already inside our second nature, is still framed as politics. It is still framed as a politicization. But the question would be if its idea of radicality also asks for something like a replacement of politics, at least of those politics that are available, which were kind of what he calls a pseudo-democracy. So necessarily also would lead to some kind of new actor beyond the conventional actors that we know. That would be somehow also, again, kind of simplistic. Diagnose that question that maybe all of you could respond to in one way or the other, in whatever order.
Well, I'm thinking, just perhaps by way of speculating further, Nicolai and Hart write in Empire that in Empire, Nicolai and Hart question the self-understanding of the counterculture of the 60s, saying that slang terms, like countercultural slang terms like dropping out, were really very poor or they really represented a very poor understanding of the revolutions in economy and subjectivity and behavior that the counterculture actually brought about. So there is, according to Nicolai and Hart, there is a failure to sort of conceptualize, articulate what the activism, experimentation that the counterculture actually did. And I guess that another failure of conceptualization could be seen to revolve around notions of holisms that create depoliticized, naturalized myths of togetherness. And I think in the exhibition, I think that there's one moment in the exhibition that I think relates to this, new life and perverse third, which is the David Bowie, the David Bowie example. It's pretty things. I think it's the
Homo superior.
Homo superior, exactly.
Yeah.
Which in the comment you're stating that there is a sort of disconcerting use of biology here.
Yeah.
The Homo superior, sort of the Superman, the giant, and
but also the pretty thing at the same time.
And the pretty thing is, I mean, another example from the counterculture would be the mutant, right? Which is also a kind of unruly teen as superhuman. And that was something that was speculated widely about in San Francisco Oracle printed a mutant manifesto, for instance. And of course, that whole history of the mutant also ties into spiritualism through Helena Blavatsky, who was writing about, the shifting civilizations and the races to succeed one another. So she was also talking about the root races, I think she calls it, which is a kind of Superman. So that's a kind of a politically unsavory sort of figure, actually, which then finds it sort of, redeemed by Donna Haraway, perhaps, in her idea of the cyborg, which is not a sort of, Homo superior, but an explicitly produced subject, an assemblage subject in the scene, a bastard, really, not a Superman. That would be one way of thinking further about this. I think maybe, I really don't know very much about the history of the concept of holism. There are various histories one could connect to. Spinoza would be one, I would imagine. Another one that Adam Curtis, in his TV series that we're using in the exhibition, what's it called? Under Machines of Love and Grace.
Yeah, Watched by Machines.
Watched by Machines of Love and Grace. This a BBC documentary directed by Adam Curtis a few years ago. He mentions that it was a South African field marshal, Jan Smuts, who in 1926 coined the term holism. And that was, in his version of holism, it was connected to apartheid. So there's
This is going to be kind of a response. I don't quite understand the thesis of the replacement of politics, but if I could pretend to align myself with that for a moment, what interests me is how if an interiority or inner world might be seen to take precedence, it could possibly be the long-awaited condition of mourning that follows the traumatic histories that give us the setting of cybernetics. So when I look at the whole Earth catalog, I read it through Philip K. Dick, and I see it as the bric-a-brac of a post-apocalyptic humanity that doesn't start over again as farmers, but sorts through the debris, more like the allegorist, according to Benjamin, than according to our other staple of survivors. So if I am suggesting that a reversal is in order, it's with regard to the specific history, the specific recent past that hosts cybernetics, and it's a reversal that I would hope to think is preliminary to politics.
Okay, so that's a very eloquent thing to have to follow. Okay, so I probably understand more about politics than about cybernetics, so I'll follow you, Larry, in that. One thing, first of all, I would not, I don't think that Marcuse is making an argument that says radical change on politics is only to take place at the level of the individual, and it's the reason I said third is because it's a little bit of like a second nature. I mean, he's using it to some extent metaphorically, and at the same time he's not. He's really talking about the need for, in effect, new people who speak new languages, have different gestures, a whole different kind of psychic life, so to speak. And so it's a necessary but not a sufficient condition to change in what he's thinking in an almost an old-fashioned Marxist revolutionary sense. You have to change the whole way of life. This is his sense, and the argument of an essay on liberation and what he sees in the variety of the ferment around him is the activation of a kind of eminent prefigurative politics. That is, in effect, what he is really calling for. And so it's not so much a replacement, certainly is a replacement of traditional, conventional interest group politics or parliamentary politics in the US context. But he's not yet, I think, calling for a replacement of politics altogether, quite the contrary. I think he's trying to actually link together a variety of different activities and groups and so on, some of which don't seem to be political at all, some of which the people who are explicitly political are criticizing, and so he's trying in effect to, where Marcuse, you could say, has more than anything else a holistic tendency, is in his effort to kind of graciously, generously create terms of what we would call alliance or affinity, or if not complete unity, then at least some capacity for these movements to do what we would call later coalition or affinity politics, which is not actually happening. And so I think that's there. What happens after Marcuse is something else, because Marcuse's working assumption is that the first world capitalist societies are actually, materially speaking, ready in the conventional Marxist sense, and so, of course, this turns out not to be correct in a whole bunch of ways. He sees it. He sees the relationship between the wealthy and the poor. He sees the colonial, post-colonial infrastructure. He sees all of that, but he's also living in this moment of really quite unusual affluence, and he's thinking in Marxist terms about the relationship between freedom and necessity, and freedom is always a kind of surplus when its necessity is. So he's operating in those logics, which are no longer quite, I think, the same, and so they necessitate also a different kind of what we would call class politics. But I also think that today by the time Marcuse died, even then, I think he was not able to deal with the situation that we really deal with now, which is enormous amounts of protests. There has been more protests in the world since 1990 than we saw during the entire period of the 60s and 70s. In terms of large numbers of people organizing in the street, coming out, making an address to their states, other states. We see no end to it. It's going on now. You just open the paper, it's going on in Brazil, and so on. There's no end to it. And yet it does not any longer generate a response by states other than, in most cases now, sheer police repression. So this has really changed the whole notion of protest-based politics. And the 60s are very, very influential in producing the model of popular politics that we call the social movement. And the protest politics, and the ubiquitous use of it, and at the same time its increasing futility and lack of success in achieving political ends means that what we are also seeing now is more and more and more of a much stronger form of refusal. That is to say, of people really refusing to participate in this at all. And again, the rise of separatisms of various sorts, of new forms of communalisms, of what someone like Hakim Bey called temporary autonomous zones. So the political field is actually in some ways, it's different, and at the same time, the basic, really simple point that Marcuse was making, which is one needs to learn how to refuse what they're offering you as what's good for you. I mean, this is the Freudian. It's like the reality principle, the reality testing, they're very much connected in that sense. This seems to me as true today as it was then, perhaps even more. So I don't know if that addresses what you
Yeah, thanks. This actually leads quite. What I was trying to get at is partly the role of that at one point this dream provided also enormous amounts of resources for the resources one could draw on and aspire and use its tilting, shifting moments as tools of, and since a lot of this has, I mean, we are talking now again using words like the cybernetic, it hasn't been done for quite a lot of years now because we've given it other names and it has just become much more environmental a condition in the techno-social milieus. And part of the intention to even just use the word again is to trying to understand what in terms of the ideological genealogies it yielded and the resources it also opened up to enter into this historical dialectics and its image space, and to understand also where the scarcity of resources is today. But so thanks for clarifying my part of this intention, where I was trying to